Baby calls the millionaire. Daddy on sight, shocking everyone. His wife are left speechless. The chandeliers sparkled like captured starlight, their soft glow cascading over the room filled with New York's elite. The charity gala was in full swing, a symphony of clinking glasses, low murmurs, and bursts of laughter echoing against the grand marble walls. Clara Hart adjusted the neckline of her simple black dress for the 10th time, hoping it masked the faint tremor in her hands. This was the kind of event where appearances were everything, and she was determined to blend in, even if her heart pounded with nerves. "Stay close, Jamie," she murmured, glancing down at her 3-year-old son, who clutched a toy truck as if it were his lifeline. The gala wasn't meant for children, but circumstances had conspired against Clara that evening. Her babysitter cancelled last minute, leaving her with no choice but to bring Jamie along. She dressed him in his best tiny dress shoes, a crisp white shirt, and a clip-on tie that he kept tugging at. Despite her reservations, Jamie had been on his best behavior, his wide brown eyes scanning the room with unfiltered curiosity. Clara exhaled and adjusted the clipboard in her hands. As the event planner for the gala, she had coordinated every detail, the floral arrangements, the seating charts, even the exclusive wine selection. Yet now, amidst a sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, she felt like an outsider. These were people who never had to choose between groceries and rent. People who would never understand her quiet battle to rebuild a life for her son after being abandoned by someone she thought she could trust. A sudden burst of laughter drew her attention to the center of the room. Standing there, commanding the space with a quiet authority, was Alexander Blake. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, as though the fabric itself had been crafted to obey him. Alex had a presence that couldn't be ignored, tall, broad-shouldered, with striking blue eyes that carried an air of mystery. Clara recognized him from the event's promotional materials. The elusive CEO of Blake Enterprises and tonight's headline donor, Clara quickly averted her gaze, focusing instead on checking her clipboard. This wasn't the time to be starstruck. Still, she couldn't help but notice how even the most influential guests gravitated toward Alex, their laughter a little louder, their smiles a little brighter in his orbit. His grandmother, Eleanor Grant, was seated nearby, her silver hair styled elegantly, a glass of champagne resting lightly in her hand. She watched Alex with a faint, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "Mommy?" Jamie's small voice broke her thoughts. "Yes, sweetheart." Clara crouched to meet his gaze. Jamie pointed toward the dessert table, where an elaborate display of chocolate sculptures towered over trays of delicate pastries. "Can I have one?" "After dinner," Clara said softly, brushing a curl off his forehead. "Just a little longer, okay?" Jamie nodded, his lip jutting out in a pout before he wandered a few steps away, captivated by the room's grandeur. Clara rose to her feet, her eyes scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble. She had just begun to relax when a sharp gasp pierced the air. "Daddy!" Jamie's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. Clara's heart stopped. She turned, dread pooling in her stomach, to see Jamie sprinting across the room. Her eyes widened in horror as he stopped in front of Alexander Blake, clutching his leg with a familiarity that made her cheeks burn. The room seemed to freeze. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned, and Clara felt every set of eyes land on her son. Alex looked down, his brows furrowing as he regarded Jamie with a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Jamie," Clara's voice trembled as she hurried forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She reached them, scooping Jamie into her arms, her face hot with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blake. He must have mistaken you for someone else." Alex's expression softened slightly, though his piercing gaze didn't waver. "It's all right," he said, his voice low and steady. Jamie tilted his head, studying Alex with innocent wonder. "You look like my daddy," he said matter-of-factly, his words carrying the kind of conviction only a child could muster. Clara's heart ached. "Jamie, sweetheart, that's enough," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. But Alex didn't seem annoyed. If anything, he looked intrigued, his sharp features softening as he crouched slightly to meet Jamie's gaze. "Is that so?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Eleanor Grant, who had been quietly observing from her seat, rose gracefully and approached. "What an interesting child," she said, her voice warm but laced with curiosity. Her eyes darted between Clara, Jamie and Alex, lingering on Jamie as if searching for something familiar. "I'm terribly sorry for the interruption," Clara stammered, clutching Jamie tighter. "He's just very imaginative." Eleanor smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Imagination is a wonderful thing, my dear. Don't apologize for that." Alex straightened, his expression unreadable as he glanced at Clara. "It's not a problem," he said simply. But something flickered in his eyes, a question, a doubt, perhaps even recognition that made Clara's stomach churn. As the attention in the room slowly shifted back to the ongoing gala, Clara excused herself, retreating to a quieter corner with Jamie. Her mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. Jamie's words replayed over and over, each syllable tightening the knot in her chest. Why had he called Alex Daddy? And why had Eleanor's smile lingered for so long? Clara didn't have the answers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had set something in motion, something she wasn't ready to face. The following morning, sunlight poured through the thin curtains of Clara's modest apartment, painting the walls in soft shades of gold. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of coffee brewing on the counter, a rare luxury Clara allowed herself on difficult mornings. Today, it was needed more than ever. Clara sat at the small round table in the corner of the kitchen, staring blankly at the newspaper open before her. The headlines blurred together, her mind refusing to focus. Her thoughts were trapped in an endless loop of the previous night, the gala, the stunned silence after Jamie's outburst, and the way Alexander Blake had looked at her son, as if he was piecing together a puzzle only he could see. She rubbed her temples, trying to will away the nagging questions. "It was just a coincidence," she muttered under her breath, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Jamie's words, his conviction, had been innocent, but their effect was anything but. "Mommy?" Jamie's small voice pulled her back to the present. Clara turned to see her son standing in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, his toy truck clutched tightly in one hand. His wide eyes were filled with curiosity. "Why did everyone look at me funny last night?" Clara's chest tightened. She knelt down, pulling him into a gentle hug. "Oh, sweetie, no one was looking at you funny. They were just surprised, that's all." Jamie pulled back slightly, his brow furrowed. "But he looked like my daddy." "I felt it." Clara froze. How could she explain to a 3-year-old the complexities of what he was saying? "Sometimes people remind us of someone," she said carefully, brushing a curl from his forehead. "But that doesn't mean they're the same person." Jamie didn't look convinced, but he nodded, his attention drifting back to his toy truck as he pushed it along the edge of the table. Clara watched him, her heart aching with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Guilt, confusion, fear. She rose to her feet, grabbing her coffee and taking a long sip. The bitter warmth steadied her, but her thoughts remained restless. There was no denying the resemblance between Alex and Jamie. It wasn't just their similar features, there was something about the way they carried themselves, the quiet confidence even a child like Jamie seemed to exude. But it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. The sharp trill of her phone broke the silence, jolting her out of her reverie. She glanced at the screen, her stomach sinking when she saw the name, Eleanor Grant. Clara hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. She had given Eleanor her number as part of the gala planning process, but she hadn't expected to hear from her after the event. With a deep breath, she answered, "Good morning, Mrs. Grant," Clara said, striving to keep her voice steady. "Good morning, Clara," Eleanor replied, her tone warm but firm. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Clara lied, her pulse quickening. "Is there something I can help you with?" "As a matter of fact, yes. I was wondering if you'd have time to meet with me today. I'd like to discuss a potential opportunity." Clara frowned, caught off guard. "An opportunity? Yes, something I think you'd find interesting." Eleanor paused, her words carefully measured. It would be easier to explain in person. Are you available this afternoon? Clara hesitated, glancing at Jamie, who was now engrossed in his toy truck. Her instincts told her to decline, to avoid whatever Eleanor was about to draw her into. But another part of her, a quieter, more desperate part, reminded her that opportunities were rare, and she couldn't afford to ignore them. Yes, Clara said finally. I can meet this afternoon. Wonderful. I'll send a car to pick you up at 2. I look forward to seeing you. The call ended, leaving Clara standing in the middle of her kitchen, her coffee forgotten in her hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far more complicated than she realized. At precisely 2 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up in front of Clara's apartment building. She adjusted her coat and smoothed her dress, casting one last glance at Jamie, who was safely in the care of her neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. "Be good, okay?" she said, kissing the top of his head. "I will, Mommy," Jamie replied, giving her a bright smile that steadied her nerves. The car ride was silent except for the soft hum of the engine. Clara tried to focus on the passing cityscape, but her thoughts kept returning to Eleanor Grant. There was a weight to the older woman's presence, a sharpness in her gaze that made Clara feel as though she were being carefully studied. The car stopped in front of an elegant townhouse, its facade pristine and unassuming. The driver opened her door, and Clara stepped out, clutching her bag tightly. Eleanor greeted her at the door, her smile warm but tinged with something Clara couldn't quite place. "Thank you for coming, Clara," Eleanor said, leading her into a sunlit sitting room, adorned with tasteful antiques and vibrant paintings. A tea tray was set on the low table, steam curling from delicate porcelain cups. "Please, sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to a plush armchair. Clara obeyed, her unease growing with each passing moment. Eleanor poured tea with practiced ease, her movements deliberate. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "I wanted to talk to you about Jamie." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "Jamie?" "Yes," Eleanor said, setting down the teapot and meeting Clara's gaze. "He's an extraordinary child, Clara. Intelligent, confident, and remarkably familiar." Clara's grip on her teacup tightened. "I'm not sure what you mean." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp and probing. "You may not realize it, but Jamie bears a striking resemblance to Alexander as a child. It's uncanny." Clara's stomach churned. She opened her mouth to respond, but Eleanor raised a hand to stop her. "I don't mean to alarm you," Eleanor said gently, "but I believe there's more to this connection than coincidence, and I think you owe it to yourself and to Jamie to find out the truth." Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. "The truth? What truth?" She wanted to deny it, to dismiss Eleanor's words as nonsense, but deep down, a small, terrified part of her wondered if Eleanor was right. And if she was, what would that mean for her and Jamie? The afternoon sunlight poured through the wide windows of the townhouse's sitting room, casting a golden glow that did little to soothe Clara's growing anxiety. Eleanor Grant sat across from her, poised and collected, her piercing gaze unyielding yet oddly compassionate. Clara placed her teacup back onto the saucer with deliberate care, her hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Grant, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." Eleanor tilted her head, her silver hair catching the light. "I think you understand more than you're willing to admit, my dear," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "Children don't often mistake strangers for their parents. Jamie's reaction last night wasn't ordinary." Clara's heart raced, her mind scrambling for an explanation that didn't lead to the conclusions Eleanor was drawing. "He's just a child. He doesn't know what he's saying." "And yet," Eleanor continued, folding her hands neatly in her lap, "he was so certain, wasn't he? The way he looked at Alex." She paused, letting her words linger like a faint echo. It was as though he recognized something, someone deep within him. Clara's breath hitched, and she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "With all due respect, Mrs. Grant, I don't see how this is relevant. Jamie has never met Alexander before last night." There's no connection." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the kind of smile that carried the weight of knowing, a quiet certainty that made Clara's skin crawl. "Perhaps not consciously," Eleanor said, "but life has a way of weaving connections even when we're unaware of them." Clara's throat tightened. She felt cornered, exposed, as though Eleanor could see right through her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression softening. "Because I believe the truth has a way of revealing itself, whether we want it to or not. And when it does, it's better to face it with clarity and courage." The car ride back to Clara's apartment was suffocatingly quiet. The driver had offered a polite nod as she stepped into the sleek vehicle, but Clara barely noticed. Her mind raced, replaying Eleanor's words over and over, each one cutting deeper than the last. She tried to reason with herself, to shove the doubts and fears back into the corners of her mind where they belonged. But every time she thought she'd succeeded, Jamie's voice echoed in her memory, "You look like my daddy." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he'd said them with such certainty, such conviction, as if it was a truth he'd known all along. By the time the car pulled up in front of her building, Clara's nerves were frayed. She thanked the driver and stepped out, gripping her bag tightly as she climbed the stairs to her apartment. She paused outside her door, her fingers hovering over the handle as she took a deep, steadying breath. Inside, Jamie's laughter greeted her, a bright, carefree sound that momentarily eased the weight on her chest. Mrs. Higgins, her elderly neighbor, looked up from the couch where she was reading a storybook to Jamie. "He's been an angel," Mrs. Higgins said, smiling warmly. "Did everything go all right?" Clara forced a smile, nodding. "Yes, thank you for watching him." Once Mrs. Higgins left, Clara knelt down to Jamie's level, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Did you have fun with Mrs. Higgins?" she asked, her voice soft. Jamie nodded enthusiastically. "She read me a story about a bear." "Can we get a bear, Mommy?" Clara chuckled despite herself. "I don't think a bear would fit in our apartment, sweetheart." Jamie giggled, but the sound faded quickly as his gaze turned serious. "Mommy, why are you sad?" The question caught Clara off guard. "I'm not sad," she said quickly, but Jamie tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that reminded her too much of Eleanor's piercing gaze. "You look like you're thinking a lot," Jamie said, frowning slightly. "Is it about the man at the party?" Clara's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Jamie shifted, clutching his toy truck tightly. "The man who looked like my daddy. Are we going to see him again?" Clara's throat tightened, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Jamie, listen to me," she said, placing her hands gently on his small shoulders. "I need you to stop saying that, okay? He's not your daddy." Jamie's brow furrowed. "But he feels like my daddy." Clara closed her eyes, her heart aching at his words. "Sweetheart," she whispered, pulling him into a hug, "sometimes things aren't as simple as they seem. But I promise, I'll always be here for you. You and me, we're a team, remember?" Jamie nodded against her shoulder, his tiny arms wrapping around her neck. "I love you, Mommy." "I love you too," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. That night, after Jamie had fallen asleep, Clara sat at the small desk in the corner of her bedroom, a stack of papers spread before her. Most were bills, reminders of the ever-present weight of her financial struggles. But among them was something else, an old photograph, its edges worn and faded. The photo showed a younger version of herself, smiling brightly as she stood next to a man with dark hair and a charming grin. His arm was draped casually around her shoulders, and his eyes sparkled with mischief. James Rowland. Clara traced the edges of the photo with her finger, her stomach twisting with a mix of anger and sadness. James had been her first love, her brightest hope and her greatest betrayal. He had disappeared before Jamie was born, leaving behind nothing but broken promises and a hollow ache that Clara had spent years trying to fill. But now, doubts crept in like shadows, their whispers growing louder with every passing moment. Could it be possible? Could Jamie's father have connections to the world she had glimpsed last night, the world of Alexander Blake and Eleanor Grant? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. It was ridiculous, coincidence, nothing more. But as she stared at the photo, her resolve wavered. Deep down, Clara knew she wouldn't find peace until she uncovered the truth. The next morning dawned quietly, the faint hum of the city waking beyond Clara's window. She stood in the kitchen, her fingers loosely clutching a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her eyes were fixed on the photo of James Rowland she had placed on the counter, her thoughts tangled in a web of questions she didn't know how to untangle. The memories felt so close, as if she could reach out and touch them, the excitement of her whirlwind romance with James, the promises they had made late at night when the world was quiet, and the heartbreak that followed when he vanished, leaving her pregnant and alone. But now there was a new layer to those memories, a shadow cast by Eleanor's words and Jamie's unwavering conviction. Clara sighed, placing the untouched tea in the sink and glancing at the clock. It was still early, and Jamie wouldn't wake for another hour. She could use the time to clear her head, but her restless thoughts wouldn't allow it. Instead, she found herself reaching for her phone, her fingers hesitating over the screen before she typed James Rowland's name into a search engine. The results were sparse, mostly outdated profiles, a few scattered mentions in obscure articles, and nothing that offered clarity. Clara clicked on a few links, skimming through the information, but her heart sank as she realized how little there was to find. It was as though James had disappeared not just from her life, but from the world itself. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. This was getting her nowhere. Maybe Eleanor was wrong. Maybe Jamie's resemblance to Alex was just a coincidence, a trick of genetics and imagination. But what if it wasn't? By mid-morning, Clara had pushed the photo of James back into the drawer and focused on keeping Jamie entertained. They spent the morning at the park, Jamie racing around the playground while Clara watched from a bench, her thoughts still clouded. The laughter of children echoed around her, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the gala and Eleanor's carefully chosen words. "Mommy, look!" Jamie's excited shout snapped her out of her reverie. She looked up to see him standing at the top of the slide, waving proudly before he slid down with a triumphant laugh. Clara smiled, the sight of his joy momentarily easing the tension in her chest. Jamie was her world, her reason for everything. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, she knew she had to protect him above all else. Later that afternoon, as Jamie napped, Clara found herself pacing the small living room. The weight of the unanswered questions had grown unbearable, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to act. Her fingers itched to call Eleanor, to demand answers, but she knew that wasn't the right approach. Eleanor was shrewd, and Clara didn't want to give away her own uncertainties until she knew more. Instead, she reached for her laptop, pulling it onto the coffee table and opening it with a determined breath. If James had vanished, then perhaps she needed to start with Alex. She hesitated only briefly before typing his name into the search bar, Alexander Blake. The search results flooded the screen, a testament to Alex's prominence. Articles about his leadership at Blake Enterprises dominated the first page, alongside photos of him at various events. Clara clicked on one of the articles, her eyes scanning the text for anything that might stand out. Alexander Blake, the article began, CEO of Blake Enterprises, has long been known for his innovative leadership and philanthropic efforts. At only 34 years old, he has transformed his family's real estate empire into a global powerhouse. Clara skimmed past the details of his professional achievements, her focus narrowing on his personal background. Her breath caught as she read about his parents, his mother, who had left the family when Alex was young, and his father, who had passed away several years ago. The article didn't go into detail, but it mentioned a strained relationship between Alex and his late father. She leaned back, her mind racing. The timeline fit. If Alex's father had been involved with James Rowland in any way, it might explain the resemblance Jamie bore to Alex. But the pieces still didn't add up. Why would James have disappeared? And why would Eleanor take such an interest in Jamie? Clara shook her head, closing the laptop with a frustrated sigh. She was chasing shadows, grasping at connections that might not even exist, but as much as she wanted to let it go, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she was on the edge of something important. That evening, Clara found herself staring at the same worn photograph of James. The questions swirled in her mind, each one more insistent than the last. She thought of Alex, of Eleanor, of Jamie's words at the gala. There was a connection, there had to be, and she was determined to find it. She picked up the photo, her fingers brushing over the image of James's face. "Who are you, really?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. Clara's resolve hardened. If no one else would give her answers, she would find them herself, for Jamie, for their future. As she placed the photo back in the drawer, she made a decision. Tomorrow she would visit Blake Enterprises. She didn't know what she would find, or how she would even get past the receptionist, but she couldn't let this go. The truth was out there, and she was going to uncover it no matter the cost. The imposing skyscraper that housed Blake Enterprises loomed before Clara like a monolith, its glass facade reflecting the city skyline and the clouds drifting lazily above. She tightened her grip on her bag, her pulse quickening as she stood at the base of the building, craning her neck to take in its sheer height. This was a world she had never dared to step into, a world of polished floors, sharp suits, and power that echoed in every corner. Jamie's small hand tugged on hers, grounding her momentarily. "Mommy, is this where the man lives?" Clara knelt to meet his wide-eyed gaze, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "No, sweetheart. This is where he works. But we're not here to see him, okay? I just need to ask some questions." Jamie nodded solemnly, clutching his toy truck close to his chest. His presence both comforted and unsettled Clara. She hadn't wanted to bring him, but finding a sitter last minute had proven impossible. Now, as she stood on the precipice of confronting a man who might upend their lives, she wondered if she should have waited, if this was even a good idea at all. Taking a deep breath, she stood and led Jamie through the revolving doors into the pristine lobby. The air was cool and smelled faintly of fresh flowers, likely from the extravagant arrangements positioned near the marble reception desk. Everything about the space screamed wealth and exclusivity, and Clara felt her nerves tighten under the weight of it all. She approached the receptionist, a polished woman in a sleek black suit, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. The woman's eyes flicked briefly to Jamie before settling on Clara with a practiced, neutral expression. "Good morning," Clara began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I was hoping to speak with Mr. Blake. Is he available?" The receptionist arched a brow, her fingers hovering over the keyboard in front of her. "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" Clara hesitated. "No, but it's urgent. I'm afraid Mr. Blake doesn't take walk-ins," the woman said briskly, her tone polite but firm. "If you'd like, I can connect you with his assistant to schedule an appointment." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Miss Hart." Clara turned sharply, her heart skipping as she saw Eleanor Grant approaching from across the lobby. The older woman was impeccably dressed, her sharp eyes flicking briefly to Jamie before settling on Clara with a mix of surprise and amusement. "What a pleasant surprise," Eleanor said, stopping a few steps away. "What brings you here?" Clara swallowed, her carefully rehearsed response evaporating under Eleanor's piercing gaze. "I needed to speak with Mr. Blake," she managed, her voice faltering. "It's important." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. "I see." She glanced at the receptionist, who was now watching the exchange with open curiosity. "That won't be necessary," Eleanor said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Miss Hart is with me." The receptionist nodded quickly, and Eleanor turned back to Clara, gesturing toward the elevators. "Shall we?" The elevator ride was silent except for the soft hum of the machinery. Jamie clung to Clara's leg, his toy truck clattering against the polished floor with every shift of his weight. Clara's mind raced, her earlier confidence now unraveling under Eleanor's calm demeanor. When the elevator doors slid open, Clara was greeted by a spacious office floor, its modern design bathed in natural light. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the city, and the faint sound of phones ringing and keyboards clicking filled the air. "This way," Eleanor said, leading Clara and Jamie down a sleek hallway lined with abstract art. At the end of the hall was a large set of double doors, slightly ajar. Eleanor pushed them open, revealing an expansive office. Alexander Blake stood by the windows, his back to them as he spoke into his phone. His tall frame was silhouetted against the sunlight, his posture rigid yet commanding. Clara's breath caught as she took him in, her nerves tightening like a coil. "Alex," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the room with ease. "You have visitors." Alex turned, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly as they landed on Clara and Jamie. He ended his call with a curt, "I'll call you back," before stepping closer, his gaze flicking between them with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Miss Hart," he said, his tone measured. "This is unexpected." Clara swallowed, feeling the weight of his scrutiny. "I know. I'm sorry for showing up like this, but I needed to speak with you." Alex's gaze shifted to Jamie, who was now peeking out from behind Clara's leg. A flicker of something recognition perhaps passed through his eyes before he returned his attention to Clara. "About what?" Clara hesitated, her carefully rehearsed words suddenly feeling inadequate. I think there might be a connection between our families," she said finally, her voice trembling. "And I think it's important we figure out what that connection is." Alex's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. "A connection," he repeated, his tone guarded. "What kind of connection?" Clara glanced at Jamie, who was now staring at Alex with wide, curious eyes. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I think you might know someone from my past," she said carefully. "Someone who's important to both of us." Eleanor stepped forward then, her sharp gaze fixed on Alex. "I think it would be wise to listen to her, Alex," she said softly, "for all our sakes." Alex's eyes flicked to Eleanor, and for a moment an unspoken exchange passed between them. Finally he nodded, gesturing toward the seating area near the windows. "All right, let's talk." As they moved to sit, Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had taken the first step into a world she didn't fully understand, and there was no turning back now. Whatever truths lay ahead, she was determined to uncover them for Jamie, for herself, and for the life they deserved. The sitting area in Alex's office felt both intimate and imposing. The low leather couches, the polished glass coffee table, and the breathtaking view of the city framed by the massive windows seemed designed to remind visitors of the power held by the man who occupied this space. Clara felt small as she sank into the plush cushion, Jamie beside her, his small fingers tracing the stitching on the couch. Alex sat across from her, his posture composed, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the cushions. Eleanor stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the interaction with a quiet patience that felt anything but passive. Clara cleared her throat, her hands twisting together in her lap. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind during the sleepless hours of the night, but now that it was here, the words stuck in her throat. Alex leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice low and even, "you mentioned a connection between our families. I need you to explain what you mean by that." Clara's pulse quickened. She glanced down at Jamie, who was preoccupied with his toy truck, then back at Alex. She hesitated, then forced herself to meet his gaze. "Do you know a man named James Rowland?" The change in Alex's expression was subtle but undeniable. His jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed slightly, though he said nothing. Eleanor was the one who spoke first. "James Rowland," she said thoughtfully, as if tasting the name. "It's been years since I've heard that name." Clara's breath caught. "You know him. Eleanor's sharp gaze flicked to Alex, then back to Clara. I know of him. He was an acquaintance of Alex's father. Alex straightened, his expression hardening. What does James Rowland have to do with this? Clara took a deep breath, her hands gripping her knees to steady herself. James Rowland was Jamie's father, she said, her voice trembling. He left before Jamie was born, and I haven't seen or heard from him since. The silence that followed her words was suffocating. Alex's eyes shifted to Jamie, who had paused his play and was now looking up at Alex with innocent curiosity. The resemblance between them, one Clara had tried so hard to ignore, felt almost tangible in that moment. Are you suggesting— Alex began, his voice laced with tension. He trailed off, his gaze snapping back to Clara. Are you saying you think I'm no? Clara said quickly, cutting him off. No, I'm not saying that. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I think there might be a connection between James and your family, and I think it might explain why he reacted the way he did at the gala. Alex sat back, his expression unreadable. Eleanor, however, seemed intrigued, her sharp eyes studying Jamie with a new intensity. Interesting, she murmured. Very interesting. Clara's chest tightened. Mrs. Grant, please, she said, her voice firm despite her nerves. If you know something, I need you to tell me. This isn't about me. It's about my son. He deserves to know the truth. Eleanor regarded Clara for a long moment, then nodded. You're right, she said. He does. She turned to Alex. And so do you. Alex's frown deepened. Eleanor James Rowland, Eleanor interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact, was involved in a business venture with your father many years ago. It ended badly. James disappeared shortly after, and your father refused to speak of him again. Clara leaned forward, her heart racing. Do you know why he disappeared? Eleanor shook her head. No, but I suspect it had something to do with money. Your father had little patience for those who crossed him in that regard. Clara's stomach churned. Do you think James might have used a different name? Lied about who he was? Eleanor raised a brow. It's possible. He was a charming man, from what I recall, but charming men often have secrets. Clara's thoughts swirled, her mind racing to piece together the fragments of information. Could James have been hiding something all along? And if so, how much of it was connected to Alex and his family? Alex exhaled sharply, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. What exactly are you getting at? He asked, his voice tinged with irritation. Clara hesitated, then decided to take the leap. I don't know what I'm getting at, she admitted. All I know is that my son— Her voice broke, and she steadied herself before continuing. My son looked at you, and he saw something, felt something. And I don't think it's just a coincidence. Alex's gaze softened slightly, but his expression remained guarded. You're asking me to believe that this— He gestured toward Jamie, who was now watching the adults with quiet curiosity— is somehow connected to a man I barely remember from years ago. I'm not asking you to believe anything, Clara said, her voice firm. I'm just asking you to help me find the truth. The room fell silent, the tension thick and unyielding. Clara held her breath, waiting for Alex's response. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. All right, he said, his voice low. I'll look into it. But I'm not making any promises. Relief washed over Clara, though she knew this was only the beginning. Thank you, she said softly. Eleanor smiled faintly, her gaze lingering on Jamie. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, she said, her tone almost wistful. You'll see. As Clara gathered her things and prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into something far more complicated than she had imagined. The answers she sought were closer now, but so were the secrets that had been buried for so long, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what she might uncover. The air outside Blake Enterprises was brisk, the first whispers of autumn brushing against Clara's face as she stepped out into the bustling city street. She tightened her grip on Jamie's hand, her thoughts still tangled in the conversation that had unfolded in Alex's office. The towering skyscraper behind her cast a long shadow over the sidewalk, its presence an unyielding reminder of the power and secrets that lay within. Jamie skipped alongside her, his toy truck clutched tightly in his free hand. His carefree energy stood in stark contrast to the turmoil churning within Clara. She couldn't decide whether to feel relieved or terrified. Alex's agreement to look into James Rowland's past was a step forward, but it also opened the door to truths she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. "Mommy, can we get ice cream?" Jamie's voice broke through her thoughts, his face lighting up with anticipation. Clara forced a smile, her gaze softening as she looked down at him. "Maybe later, sweetheart. Let's get home first." Jamie pouted but nodded, his small legs working to keep up with her as they made their way toward the subway station. Clara's mind wandered back to Eleanor's cryptic words, the weight of her gaze as she spoke of the past. There was something about the older woman's demeanor, a quiet knowing that made Clara both uneasy and curious. Back at their apartment, Clara settled Jamie with his favorite puzzle before retreating to the small kitchen. She leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the kettle as it heated on the stove. The faint hiss of steam matched the tension in her chest, a pressure that seemed to build with every unanswered question. She pulled out her phone, hesitating for a moment before opening her messages. Her thumb hovered over Alex's name. She had saved his contact information after their meeting, though she hadn't planned on using it so soon. But now she found herself typing out a message, her words carefully chosen. "Clara, thank you for agreeing to help. I know this isn't easy for you." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, the small act sending a ripple of anxiety through her. A response came almost immediately. "Alex, it's not about easy. It's about getting answers." Clara stared at the message, her chest tightening. His words were blunt, almost cold, but she understood the undercurrent of determination behind them. Alex was just as invested in uncovering the truth now, even if he wouldn't admit it outright. Her phone buzzed again. "Alex, I'll let you know if I find anything. In the meantime, stay patient." Clara exhaled slowly, setting the phone down on the counter. Patience had never been her strong suit, especially not now when so much was at stake. She turned her attention back to the kettle, pouring the boiling water into a chipped mug and watching as the tea bag swirled lazily in the cup. Her thoughts drifted to James, the man who had once been her entire world. The image of his charming smile and easy laugh felt distant now, almost like a dream. But the pain of his betrayal was still fresh. The wound reopened with every step she took toward the truth. "Why did you leave, James?" she thought, her fingers tightening around the mug. "What were you hiding?" Later that evening, after Jamie had fallen asleep, Clara sat at the small desk in the corner of her bedroom, the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows across the room. The worn photo of James was spread out before her, along with the few documents she had managed to dig up about his past. It wasn't much, a few old addresses, a couple of expired IDs, but it was all she had to go on. She reached for her laptop, opening it and hesitating briefly before typing James's name into the search bar again. This time she added a few key terms, locations he had mentioned in passing, the name of a business he had once worked for. The results were still sparse, but one caught her attention, an article from nearly a decade ago, buried deep in the search results. Clara clicked on it, her breath catching as she scanned the text. The article described a failed business venture involving several investors, one of whom was named James Rowland. The venture had collapsed amid accusations of fraud and mismanagement, leaving its backers in financial ruin. Clara's stomach churned. The timeline matched. This must have been the connection Eleanor had mentioned, the failed deal between James and Alex's father. But what did it mean? And why had James vanished afterward? Her eyes skimmed further down the article, her pulse quickening as she reached the final paragraph. It mentioned legal action taken by one of the investors, a prominent businessman named Richard Blake. Clara leaned back in her chair, the name echoing in her mind. Richard Blake, Alex's father. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was still murky, incomplete. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something hidden just beneath the surface. The next day, Clara found herself pacing the length of her apartment, the unease from her discovery refusing to dissipate. She debated whether to share what she had found with Alex, unsure if it would help or complicate things further. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her train of thought. She picked it up, her heart skipping when she saw Alex's name on the screen. "Alex, meet me tomorrow at 10. The address is below." Clara frowned, reading the message twice. There was no explanation, no context, just the address of what appeared to be a private office building in Midtown. She typed out a quick response. "Clara, what's this about?" The reply came almost instantly. "Alex, you wanted answers. So do I." Clara stared at the message, her chest tightening with a mix of anticipation and dread. Whatever Alex had found, it was clear that the road ahead was about to take another sharp turn. As the day wore on, Clara prepared herself for the meeting, her mind running through every possibility. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, the truth just out of reach, but tantalizingly close. And she wasn't sure whether it would save her or pull her under. The doors opened to reveal Alex, waiting for her in the hallway. He was dressed impeccably as always, but his expression was different, tense, guarded, and tinged with something Clara couldn't quite place. "Miss Hart," he greeted, nodding briefly before his gaze dropped to Jamie. For a moment, his guarded demeanor softened, the faintest flicker of a smile crossing his lips before he caught himself. "Thank you for coming." Clara nodded, her grip tightening on Jamie's hand. "You said you had something to show me." Alex gestured for her to follow him, leading them down a short corridor to a small conference room. Inside, Eleanor was already seated at the table, her expression calm but watchful. A stack of papers sat in front of her, neatly arranged, and a tablet glowed softly at her side. "Mrs. Grant," Clara said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Clara," Eleanor replied warmly, her sharp eyes flicking to Jamie before returning to Clara. "I'm glad you came." Alex closed the door behind them, his movements precise and deliberate. He crossed to the table, standing beside Eleanor as he gestured to the documents. "We've been digging into James Rowland's past," he said, his tone clipped but professional, "and what we found raises more questions than it answers." Clara stepped closer, her heart pounding as she took a seat across from them. Jamie climbed into the chair beside her, his toy truck clattering against the table as he settled in. Alex's eyes lingered on the boy for a moment before he turned his attention back to Clara. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor slid the top document toward her. It was an old photo, grainy but clear enough to make out the faces of the 3 men it captured. Clara's breath caught as she recognized James standing beside 2 older men. One of them was unmistakably Richard Blake. "This was taken shortly before the failed business venture we discussed," Eleanor explained. "James was working closely with Richard at the time, but as we suspected, he wasn't entirely honest about his background." Alex leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "James Rowland wasn't his real name," he said. "It was an alias." Clara's stomach twisted. What was his real name? Eleanor's gaze softened, her voice low but firm. James Rowland was actually James Blake, Richard's illegitimate son. The room seemed to tilt, the revelation hitting Clara like a physical blow. She stared at the photo, her mind struggling to process the implications. Jamie's father had been part of the Blake family all along. "That's why he disappeared," Alex continued, his voice cold. "When the deal fell apart, my father cut ties with him completely. He erased him from our family's history, made sure no one could trace him back to us. But clearly James found a way to keep living his life, just under a different name." Clara felt the air leave her lungs. "And Jamie," she said, her voice trembling. "What does this mean for Jamie?" Eleanor reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Clara's. "It means that Jamie is part of this family," she said, "whether you like it or not." Clara's chest tightened. She glanced at Jamie, who was obliviously pushing his truck across the table, his laughter soft and sweet. He had no idea how much his world was about to change. "I don't want anything from you," Clara said suddenly, her voice stronger than she felt. "I didn't come here for money or status. I just wanted to understand." Alex's gaze softened slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "We know that. But this isn't just about you anymore. Jamie deserves to know where he comes from." Clara nodded slowly, her thoughts racing. She had spent years trying to shield Jamie from the pain of his father's absence, but now the truth was laid bare, undeniable and irrevocable. He had a family, one far more complicated and powerful than she had ever imagined. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Eleanor's smile was gentle but resolute. "Now we move forward. Together." The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments. Alex began visiting more frequently, his bond with Jamie growing stronger with each passing day. Despite his initial reservations, it was clear that he was determined to be a part of Jamie's life, and by extension Clara's. For Clara, the transition was anything but easy. She struggled to reconcile the man she had loved and lost with the revelations of his hidden past. But as she watched Jamie laugh and play with Alex, she realized that her son had found something she had never been able to give him, a sense of belonging. Eleanor, ever the matriarch, took Clara under her wing, offering guidance and support as she navigated the new dynamics of her life. Slowly but surely, Clara began to see the Blakes not as an imposing monolith, but as a family, a flawed, complicated family, but a family nonetheless. Months later, as the first snowfall of winter blanketed the city, Clara stood by the window of her apartment, watching Alex and Jamie build a snowman in the courtyard below. Their laughter echoed through the cold air, warm and bright, and Clara felt a pang of gratitude she hadn't expected. The truth had been messy and painful, but it had also opened the door to something she hadn't dared to hope for: connection, authentic, genuine connection. As Alex glanced up and caught her eye, his smile was easy and unguarded, and for the first time, Clara felt a flicker of hope. They weren't just rebuilding the pieces of their lives, they were building something entirely new. Years later, Jamie sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by family. His laughter rang out, the sound of a boy who had grown up loved and supported. Clara watched him, her heart full as she exchanged a glance with Alex, now her partner in every sense of the word. Life had not been easy, but it had led them here to a place of healing, growth, and love. And for that, Clara was endlessly grateful. In the end, Clara's journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about finding connection, resilience, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. A single moment, a single word from her son set into motion a story that changed their lives forever. And as Clara, Alex, and Jamie stepped into their new future, they proved that even the most unexpected beginnings can lead to something extraordinary. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think about the importance of family and connection, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories just like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.